the process chart that you see here. And I'm going to help you understand how to memorize this process chart in the next 10 minutes. So you're in for a treat here. So it's really important that you understand how to read this chart properly, which not many people do because they just see a whole bunch of terms on here and it's hard to interpret that. But once you understand how to read this chart, you will understand PMI's methodology for how to manage projects. So across the columns, across the top here, you have your 5 process groups. And the process group is another way for PMI to say the timeline of projects. So at the start of your project, you initiate it. Once the project has been initiated, then you plan for it. Once the planning is done, then you execute it. Once the execution is done, then you monitor and control it to make sure everything is going according to plan. And once the project is finished, you move into the closing process group. So this really shows you the timeline of the project. And across the rows here, we have our 10 knowledge areas, which are integration, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resource, communications, risk, procurement, and stakeholders. And you can really think of these as different categories or buckets that you can group these processes in. You have all of the tasks related to scope, all of the tasks related to cost, etc. So these are different buckets or categorizations that you can group the processes in. So, and then in the intersection between the knowledge area and the process groups, you have your 49 processes. So each of these 49 processes has a corresponding knowledge area and process groups. The knowledge area shows you which bucket of tasks they belong in, and the process group shows you when they happen in the project. And as we have been trained to do in school, we're really used to reading charts from left to right, which is how we normally read a paper or so forth. But that's actually not the right way to read the process chart. The proper way that you want to read this process chart is up and down, because you have to connect the dots of how this project is going to be completed first. So we start at the top as initiating. So we develop our project charter first, which initiates our project, and then we identify our stakeholders. So we have to complete the task in initiating first before we can move on to planning, where we develop our project management plan. We define our scope, we plan our schedule, we budget our project, etc. And then we move on to execution and so forth. So we have to do it in the right timeline. So when we read this chart, we have to go up and down first to really connect how all of these 49 processes connect in a sequence in order to complete the project. And because most people are reading left to right, they can't see how this project is connected from start to finish, and this causes a lot of confusion to candidates. Okay, now that you know how to interpret this chart and you know how to dissect this chart, let's talk about how to memorize it. So the PMP and the CAPM exam are not memorization exams. However, there are a couple of things that are good to have memorized, such as the 10 knowledge areas. So one quick trick to help you memorize the 10 knowledge areas is by using phrases that begin with the same first letters as the 10 knowledge areas. So the 10 knowledge areas, again, are integration, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resources, communications, risk, procurement, and stakeholder. And the phrase that I like to use to memorize the 10 knowledge areas is, I saw 6 cars quickly rip Carol's rear passenger side. And we can see is that the first letters of this phrase matches with the same first letters of the 10 knowledge areas. And when you memorize this phrase, it's going to jog your memory as to what the 10 knowledge areas are. This works because our brains work by association. So when you memorize something that you already know and associate it with something you don't know, you're going to be able to memorize the thing that you don't know much faster. And if you don't like that particular phrase, here are some other ways that you can use to memorize the 10 knowledge areas. You just have to pick the phrase that you like the best. You don't have to know all 5 that's on this slide right here, but I'm going just to read it out to you. You can use the phrase, I scoped schedule, cost, and quality with resource communications as risk on procurement to stakeholders. The second one is, I suddenly saw crows quite quickly read code and referring to new poetic songs. The third one is integrating scope and schedule will cost our quality resource to communicate with risk of procuring stakeholders. The fourth one is I suddenly saw a cat. Quick, Romeo can run pretty swiftly. And then the last one is what we saw earlier, and that is I saw 6 cars quickly wrap Carol's rear passenger side. Well, it's a variation of the one that we saw earlier. Anyway, pick your favorite phrase and use it to help you memorize the 10 knowledge areas. Then next we have the 5 process groups. The 5 process groups are initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing. And the way that you can use to memorize the 5 process groups is to use this phrase, which is in physical education, Mary cries constantly. Again, the first letters of this phrase matches with the first letters of the 5 process groups. Okay, so we looked at how to memorize the 5 process groups using this phrase, and we also looked at how to memorize the 10 knowledge areas using one of these phrases, which matches with the same first letters as the 10 knowledge areas. Now, let's take a look at the 49 processes, and it is now that I want to introduce you to the phone number technique. So when we look at how many processes are within each of the 10 knowledge areas, we see that there's 7 processes within integration, 6 within scope, 6 within schedule, and so forth. And what we do when we combine all of these numbers together, we get a phone number, which is 766-436-3734. But please don't call this number. Whomever owns this number might be pretty upset if we send 100 people calling this number all at once. So please don't call this number. Anyway, so what this number serves as is a sanity check for you. So when you go through this chart and you suddenly forgot a specific process, you can use this technique to check and see exactly in which knowledge area you forgot that process in. That could help you jog your memory as to what that process is supposed to be. So now let's look at how to fill in the 49 processes in the chart. The first thing we want to do is to fill in the corners. We can see that there is a process in all 3 corners of the process chart: develop project charter, identify stakeholders, and close project or phase. The only corner that doesn't have a process is the bottom right-hand corner. Once we have our corners filled in, then we can fill in our plan processes. So every single process in the 10 knowledge areas begin with the plan process. So for example, scope management has plan, scope management as a process, quality management has plan, quality management as a process, risk management has plan, risk management as a process. And the reason you have that is that the plan process it's when you're planning out how you're going to do all of the other processes within that knowledge area. So you can just fill in all your plan processes. And the next pattern we see is that in the monitoring controlling process group, each of the processes either begin with a monitor process or a control process. So for example, schedule management has the control schedule process, and communication has the monitor communications process, and stakeholder management has monitor stakeholder engagement as a process. So the first process within each of the knowledge areas inside of monitoring controlling either begin with a monitor or a control process. And you might be wondering, well, how do I know which process begins with monitor and which ones begin with control? Well, to help you with that, I have a little song, quote unquote. I say that very loosely at the bottom of this slide right here, which is MCCCC and MCM. So you can kind of use that rhythm to help you memorize whether it's a monitor or control. Let me say that again. It's MCCCC, MMCM. So it's almost like a cheerleader sort of rhythm song thing at the bottom. So you can kind of use that to help you remember whether it's a monitor process or control. Now, just at this point, we already have half of our chart filled out just by using those 3 simple rules. Unfortunately, there isn't as much pattern in the remainder of the process chart, but what I can tell you is that you want to use logic to then help you connect the dots as to which process comes first and which one comes next. So what we can see from, let's just use scope management as an example here. There's 6 processes within scope. First, you plan out your scope in plan scope management. Then you collect all your requirements from your stakeholders, and then you pick which requirements are going to be included in your project scope and which ones are not. This is when you define your scope. Then once you have your scope defined, you can break that scope down into your WBS or your work breakdown structure. And then once in execution, all this work has been implemented, you want to validate your scope and control your scope. So when you connect the dots of how these different processes work together in order to complete the project and the sequence that they're supposed to happen in, you will logically be able to deduct which processes will follow and be able to remember this chart much faster. I usually don't say that you need to memorize a lot for the PMP exam, because the purpose of the exam is to make sure that you are a certified project manager, so you have everything in your tool belt in order to help you actually do the work when it's a real life situation. And it's not really a memorization exam, but there is some couple things that are really good to have memorized, such as the process chart, because it is really like the skeleton of the PMBOK guide, and the PMBOK really just drills into each of these 49 processes in much more detail, which brings us to our next point, which is the ITTOs, which stands for inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs. So this is when we in the PMBOK guide, they will drill into each of these 49 processes and tell you exactly how to complete each of these processes. They're not just going to tell you, okay, this is what you're doing on a high level. So we looked at the high level, the 10,000 feet view, which is this is how the project is going to complete it. Now we need to dive deeper into how do we actually complete each of these processes. And this is when the ITTOs come into place. Let's take a look at an ITTO. One of the processes, let's take plan scope management as an example, so you will understand what I mean. The first thing you want to know about each of these processes is, what is this process supposed to do? So plan scope management is when you determine how the scope is defined, validated, and controlled. And you will document all of this in your scope management plan. Essentially, in this process, you're planning out how you are going to approach all of the other processes within scope management. Now that you know what the process is about, let's take a look at the ITTOs, which again stands for input, tools, and techniques and outputs. So here is the ITTO for plan scope management. We have our inputs, which is our project management plan, project charter, EF, which stands for enterprise environmental factors, and OPA, which stands for organizational process assets. And when you read this chart, what this chart is telling you is how you are going to transform these inputs into the outputs using the tools and techniques. So the analogy I like to use here is cooking. So inputs are your ingredients. So let's say we're baking a cake right now. So your inputs could be flour, eggs, butter, sugar, etc. The tools and techniques is the way that you transform the inputs into the output. So here we can have mixing and baking and stirring, and then the final output that we have is the delicious birthday cake that we built. So when you understand this is how you're supposed to read the ITTO chart, and we know that our end purpose is to create our scopes management plan. So here, what we have is that we're going to use our project management plan, our project charter, our project environment, which is our EF and OPA. Then we're going to use these tools and techniques, which are our expert judgment, data analysis, and meetings. We're going to meet with our experts in meetings and use data analysis in order to create our scope management plan and our requirements management plan. So essentially, the ITTO chart tells you what tools you can use in order to complete this process. It's giving you the recipe for how this process is supposed to be completed. Okay, so now we covered how to read the process chart, how to dissect the ITTOs, and one important thing about the ITTOs is that you do not need to memorize the ITTO chart for all 49 processes. You would drive yourself nuts. There's over 600 of them. I would not recommend it. The point is, when you look at this chart, you have to be able to understand every component and see how each of these components can actually help you achieve the objective of the process. Okay, now that we really covered the backbone of the PMBOK, next thing I want to cover with you is how to fill in your PMP application. In order to submit your PMP application, the first thing you do is you go on pmi.org, and the first portion of your application is quite mechanical. You just fill in your address, your name, where you went to school, etc., your contact information. If you're writing your CAPAM certification, then determining your work experience isn't applicable to you. But if you are writing your PMP certification, then you need to be able to determine how many hours you worked in each of the work experiences. And this can be tricky if your project happened a couple years ago and you didn't track exactly how many hours you have done on each of the tasks. So at this point, you just want to do a high-level estimate. So for example, I worked on this project for 1 year. I took a 2-week vacation, so that's 50 weeks. I worked 40 hours a week, so 50 times 40 is 2,000 hours. So I'm going to claim 2,000 hours for this project. As long as the contact person you have for that project agrees with your estimate, then you're good to go. So PMI defines a project as it has a definitive beginning and end and creates a unique product service result. So keeping that definition of a project in mind, then you can pick out which projects fits within that definition of a project and which ones are operational work which will not count towards your PMP exam. So once you have all your projects ready, you are now ready to write your project descriptions, and I'll give you a 3-step formula that will help you pass the PMI audit every single time. You ready? Okay, let's jump into it. So here is the winning formula to writing your project descriptions. So the first sentence should briefly describe the project and your role on the project. And I'll give you an example of this right after this as well. The second to sixth sentence should describe the task you have done within each of the 5 process groups. So if you have claimed hours for all 5 of the process groups, then you need 1 sentence for each of those 5 process groups to describe what task you have done within that process group. And then the third step is to briefly describe the outcome of the project. Now, when you are writing your PMP application descriptions, you have to be really careful to use PMI terminologies. I know you might use other terms on your project, but because you're writing your PMP application right now, so you have to use the terminologies within the PMBOK guides, because this is going to indicate to PMI that you understand their methodology. So here are some sample terminologies within each of the 5 process groups and terms that you can use to describe what you have done. So in the past, I've seen students say, I initiated the project, then I planned the project, then I executed the project, then I monitored and controlled the project to ensure everything went smoothly, then I closed the project. And that's not really what PMI is looking for. They're looking for you to use a specific task within each of these 5 process groups to demonstrate to them that you actually understand what is going on. So now let me give you an example of a great description and a bad description. I'm going to give you the example of the bad description first. And by the way, these are real descriptions that some of our past students have submitted. So let's go into the before version. So this person wrote, this project is an ongoing project where I am required to be part of the initiating stages, extensively input during the planning stages, fully responsible for the execution of the project, partly responsible controlling and closing out the projects. The project varied from network planning to new software development. I am responsible for ensuring that all internally developed and outsourced mission critical applications within the organization are operational at all times and required to design, build, test, and deploy new applications. So first of all, who understood what actually happened on this project? Because I certainly didn't. This is like a lot of really long sentences that doesn't tell me what is happening in this project at all. This person is saying that I did everything and nothing at the same time. So we help this person to clean up this description, and this is what it looked like after, and this person did go on to submit their application, pass the PMI audit, and he is now PMP certified. So this is what it looked like. So this project automates the company's manual process for accepting work requests. So the first sentence really clearly says what this process is about, this project is about. Then my colleague and I defined the scope of the system, created delivery schedule, and conducted weekly update meetings. So this is what he did in planning. We also procured service providers to launch the web portal. When the project ended, I helped create an online knowledge base to archive all permanent documents and reusable code. So this is what he did in monitoring, controlling, and closing. The end result is an online information management system. So because this person only claimed hours for 3 of the 5 process groups, this is good to go. If you claimed hours in all 5, then you need to, go back and look at this and really make sure you have at least one terminology for each of the 5 process groups that you have claimed hours for. Now that we have looked at the application, let's now look at the exam. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the PMP exam is made up of 200 multiple choice questions, and choosing the right answer might be a little tricky. So if you haven't seen the PMI style of testing yet, then you might not be able to relate to what I'm saying. But for those who have looked at some of the past practice exams before, then you know that these multiple choice questions are not always straightforward, and especially when you get into the situational questions. So let's talk about how you can choose the right answers on your exam. So before we get into the actual tactics, here is a secret that I want you to know. So you might already know that the PMP certification is all the rage right now, and it has really grown in both popularity and prestige over the years. And what this means is that PMI has more resources and people than ever before working on developing the certification to make it even better. And what happens when an organization grows is that they start to specialize. There's different teams that start to form. So one thing you might not know is that the group that's responsible for updating the PMBOK guide is different for the group that's responsible for developing the exam questions, which is called the RDS, Role Delineation Study. So they go out and they survey thousands of different project managers from different countries and different expertise and different industries to try to find out what they actually do on a day-to-day job. So the test takers, the group that's writing the actual questions, are interpreting the PMBOK just like you. And because these two teams don't really talk to each other, there is a disconnect between the PMBOK guide and the exam. And what this means is that you could read the PMBOK guide 10 different times and you could sit for your PMP exam and you probably will still not pass. So what's the solution for this? The solution for this is that before your exam, you must do as many practice questions as possible. You have to get used to the way that PMI tests you. You have to get used to these uncomfortable situational questions, and you have to be able to interpret the PMBOK guide and be able to apply the knowledge that you have learned. So you might be wondering, well, how many practice questions should I do? I would suggest that you do a minimum of 1,000 practice questions with at least 2 full-length exams. So each full-length exam is 200 questions or more before your actual exam. I would actually suggest 1,500 questions or more with 3+ full-length exams just to make sure you are fully prepared on your first try. When you're doing these exams, you should be aiming for 80% or more because, as I explained earlier, the PMP passing score is most likely between 61 to 68%. So if you score 80 plus, then you're giving yourself more than a 10% margin of error. So if you get nervous on your exam or anything like that, you know you have that buffer so you can still feel really confident when you're walking into your exams. Now that we talked about why it is important for you to do as many practice questions as possible, let's talk about some some test-taking strategies so you will score higher on your PMP exam. So when you're looking at the PMP questions, usually when you're looking at the 4 multiple choices, you can generally eliminate 2 right off the bat because they're not even related to the question. And you can use this process of elimination to really increase your odds of getting the question correct. With the 2 answers you have left, then even if you guess, you have a 50% chance of getting that question correct. Now, one important thing you should note is that if you're taking your PMP exam, that most of the questions you're going to see on your exam is going to be situational questions. About 70 to 80% of your questions are 70 to 80% of your exams are going to be situational questions. And to approach situational questions, the great thing you have to ask yourself is, what's the best thing to do next? Even if the question doesn't say these specific words, you need to add this phrase at the end of all of your questions to prompt you, to help you decide on what the right answer is. To illustrate this point, let's look at a sample question. So Sally, your developer, tells you that the activities you've assigned her has been delayed. What's the best thing to do? 1, reschedule your project. 2, notify your project sponsor. 3, inform your customer that the project is going to be delayed. Or 4, call a meeting to discuss the situation and alternatives with your team. Now, when you look at these 4 options, in real life, can't you do all 4 of these options? When something is delayed, can't you reschedule your project, notify your sponsor, inform your customer, and call a meeting? Yes, you can do all of them. So even though the question doesn't specifically say what's the best thing to do next, it's like you have to add that phrase at the end of the question for yourself and ask yourself, out of these 4 answers, what is the best thing to do next? Because it's about choosing the best answer when all of these answers look correct. And in this case, the correct answer is number 4. You want to call a meeting and just discuss the situation with your team first before you reschedule it, before you inform your customer and your sponsor. Another tip for situational questions is you have to figure out what's important and what's not important in the question. PMI purposely include some facts in the question that are not important just to trick you up. And they do this because in real life situations, you are going to be given facts that's not relevant to the problem and facts that are. And you need to be able to distinguish what's important and what's not. So let's take a look at a sample question that will illustrate what I mean by this. So your PMO or project management office provides you with procurement policies and documentations to use for your project. These documents are part of your company's blank. Is it A, OPA, B, EEF, C, ITTO, or D, RFP? Now, another way that you can word this question is, you are a project manager with 10 plus years of experience in the automotive industry. You've been recently promoted to a senior project manager position. Today's your first day managing your project. Your PMO provides you with the procurement policies and documentation to use for your project. These documents are part of your company's blank. So what you can see is that in this variation of this question, you're given an extra paragraph at the top that has nothing to do with what they're asking for in the question. So it's irrelevant that you have been working for 10 years as a senior project manager and you just started on a new role. What they're asking here is what these documentations are a part of. And by the way, the right answer is AOPA, which stands for Organizational Process Assets, which includes all of your company's policies, procedures, and plans and lessons learned. So the procurement policies and documentation would be a part of your company's OPA. So knowing these 2 tips by itself, you will significantly increase your score next time you do practice questions. Now, another thing you should know, and this really highlights the disconnect between the PMBOK and the PMP exam, is that the questions they're going to get are situational questions that apply the PMBOK concepts. So if you just know the concept by itself and you never did these practice questions, your chances of succeeding is pretty low. So you have to know how to apply the PMBOK concepts on the situational questions. So let me give you one example of what I mean here. So in the risk management knowledge area, there is one section where they give you 5 strategies to deal with threats and 5 strategies to deal with opportunities. Both opportunities and threats are risk. A risk is an uncertain event that may or may not happen in the future. So the 5 strategies to deal with threats are avoid, accept, transfer, mitigate, and monitor. So this is what it says in the Pinpoint Guide. If you just have this memorized, so you have your first level of understanding. However, on the actual questions in the risk management knowledge area, you won't have questions where they ask you, what's the 5 strategies to deal with threats? So more likely, they will give you a scenario, and then you have to identify which one of these 5 strategies are used, or you have to identify the specific strategy to use, and they give you a situation. You have to identify the proper strategy to use in that scenario. So you have to understand this concept of what is a different way to deal with threats, and then be able to apply it. So that's what I mean by you have to know how to apply all of the different concepts from the Pinball Guide into situational questions. And go with your first gut impression. Your first impression is generally right. So if you're unsure what the correct answer should be, go with your first impression. And because there's no negative marking on the PMP exam, if you don't know an answer, just guess. Don't leave anything blank, because if you just guess, you'll still get a 25% chance of getting that question correct. So if you just have 2 more minutes left on your exam, you have 10 more questions to go, just put C or something in all of those questions, so at least you'll get a couple of them right. All right, now let's talk about everyone's favorite topic, this controversial topic in the PMP field, which is brain dumps. Somebody loves them, some other people hate them. So let's talk about what they are. So when you walk into your PMP exam, you will be given 2 blank pieces of legal sized paper that you can write whatever you want on them during your exam. Now, if you want an extra sheet of paper, you have to give back one of the sheets of paper that you already wrote on, which usually has important notes and stuff like that on the paper. So I would not recommend it. So for all intensive purposes, assume that you just have 2 pieces of paper. Now, what some people like to do is use the first 5 to 10 minutes of their exam time to write a cheat sheet or brain dump for themselves, which would jog their memory to the important things that they should note throughout their exam. Here's some examples of brain dumps. Now, my take on this is that when you're doing your practice exams and you notice that when you have this brain dump, it really helps you organize your thoughts and get everything together and really focus on the key points that you need to note, and really help you memorize the things that you're weak on, like contract types or EACs or all these formulas, then for sure use the first 5 to 10 minutes to draw out this cheat sheet for yourself. Just have a couple examples here of different things that you can put on your cheat sheet. I'm not going to walk through what all of these different things are, but if you stick to the end, you're going to get all the slides so you can dissect them on your own time as well. But if you notice when you're doing the practice exams, you didn't really need the first